Tonight we're diving into one of medicine's darkest chapters, a practice so obviously harmful to our modern eyes that it defies belief. And yet, for 2,000 years, it was embraced by the most brilliant minds in human history. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. December 14th, 1799, Mount Vernon, Virginia. In the cold hours before dawn, 3 physicians stand over a dying man. He's 67 years old, a war hero, the first president of the United States, George Washington. He'd woken the previous morning with a sore throat. Common enough. By evening, he could barely breathe. Now, as winter darkness presses against the windows, the doctors do what any learned physician of their time would do. They bring out their lancets, their porcelain bowls, their leeches. They open his veins. Over that terrible night and the following day, they drain nearly half the blood from his body. Roughly 5 pints from a man already weakened by fever, already struggling for air. They're trying to save him. They're following the wisdom of 2 millennia, the accumulated knowledge of the greatest medical minds in history, and they are almost certainly killing him. This is not a story about incompetence, it's about certainty, about how a practice so lethal could be embraced for 2,000 years by some of the most brilliant thinkers humanity ever produced. It's a story of blood, belief, and the seductive power of a beautiful theory. Let's begin where all medicine begins, with blood. Blood has always been the great mystery. Long before there were physicians, before cities or empires or written language, blood was recognized as the essence of life itself. When it flowed freely from a wound, life drained away with it. When it remained within the body, warm and pulsing beneath the skin, life continued. It was the most obvious, the most visible connection between the physical and the vital. Life made liquid. The earliest humans understood this fundamental equation. Blood equals life. Loss of blood equals death. Simple, self-evident, it became embedded in ritual and religion. The ancient Hebrews declared that the life of the flesh is in the blood. The Romans poured it on their altars. The Aztecs built entire theological systems around it, offering it to the gods to keep the sun moving across the sky. But there was a paradox here, one that the first physicians would grapple with for centuries. If blood was life, could there be too much of it? Could the very substance that sustained the body also, in excess, sicken it? For the ancient world, the answer was yes. The story of bloodletting as formal medical practice begins in ancient Greece, the 5th century before the Common Era, the age of Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine. A physician from the island of Kos, whose writings would shape medical thought for over 2,000 years. Hippocrates and his school didn't invent bloodletting. Tribal healers had practiced crude forms for millennia, lancing boils, draining abscesses. But the Hippocratic physicians did something revolutionary. They gave it a theory. They proposed a model of the human body that was elegant, rational, utterly compelling. They called it the theory of the 4 humours. According to this framework, the body wasn't a single unified thing. It was a delicate ecosystem of 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour associated with an element: blood with air, phlegm with water, yellow bile with fire, black bile with earth. Each had its qualities: hot or cold, wet or dry. Each governed certain temperaments and bodily functions. Health was a matter of balance. When the 4 humours existed in perfect equilibrium within the body, the person was well. When one humour became excessive or deficient, illness resulted. A fever, too much yellow bile, hot and dry, a cold, too much phlegm, cold and wet, melancholy, that deep pervasive sadness, an overabundance of black bile. It was a beautiful system, symmetrical, complete. It explained everything, and if illness was the result of imbalance, then the cure was obvious. Restore the balance, remove the excess. If a person had too much blood, hot and wet, causing fever and inflammation, the solution was simple. Drain some of it away. Bloodletting in this framework wasn't barbaric. It was logical, scientific by the standards of the ancient world. The Hippocratic physicians approached it with care and precision. They wrote detailed instructions. When and where to bleed a patient, which veins to open for which ailments, how much blood to take. They cautioned against excess. They urged observation and moderation. But the true architect of bloodletting as a dominant medical practice wasn't Hippocrates. It was a man who came centuries later, a physician whose shadow would stretch across the entire history of Western medicine, whose writings would be treated as gospel, whose authority would be so absolute that to question him was professional suicide. His name was Galen of Pergamon. Galen was born in 129 CE in the Greek city of Pergamon, in what is now Turkey. His father was a wealthy architect. Galen grew up in a world of learning, privilege, ambition. He studied philosophy first, but a dream, so he later claimed, directed him toward medicine. He travelled widely. Smyrna, Corinth, Alexandria, the great centres of ancient learning. He dissected animals, pigs, goats, monkeys. Human dissection was forbidden. From these studies, he built what he believed to be a comprehensive understanding of anatomy and physiology. In truth, Galen's anatomy was deeply flawed. He assumed, often incorrectly, that animal structures mirrored human ones. But his confidence was absolute, his rhetoric dazzling, his productivity staggering. He wrote hundreds of treatises covering every aspect of medicine: diagnosis, pharmacology, the nature of the soul. Galen refined and expanded the Hippocratic theory of the humours into a grand unified system. But where Hippocrates urged caution, Galen urged aggression. He believed disease was almost always the result of an excess of blood. Plethora, he called it, the root cause of most ailments: fevers, headaches, inflammations, seizures, apoplexy, all stem from too much blood in the system. And so, he prescribed bloodletting with enthusiasm that bordered on zeal. He developed elaborate charts and diagrams, which veins to open for which conditions: headache, bleed from the forehead; chest pain, the arm; digestive troubles, the leg. He even advocated bleeding patients until they fainted. The loss of consciousness, he argued, was a sign the excess plethora had been successfully drained. Galen's authority was immense. He served as physician to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his successors, a position that cemented his reputation. His writings were encyclopedic, persuasive, preserved with meticulous care by scholars in the Islamic world during the European Dark Ages, then reintroduced to the West during the medieval period. By the Middle Ages, Galen's texts had become the foundation of all medical education. To be a physician was to study Galen. To practice medicine was to follow Galen. His word was law. And so the practice of bloodletting, turbocharged by Galen's teachings, became the cornerstone of Western medicine. Not just one treatment among many. The treatment, the first resort for nearly every ailment imaginable. For over 1,000 years, if you fell ill, a physician would almost certainly prescribe the opening of a vein. The medieval world inherited this practice and embraced it with fervour that bordered on religious. In the monasteries and universities of Europe, where medical knowledge was preserved and transmitted, Galen's works were copied and recopied, studied and memorized. They were treated not as observations of one man, but as eternal truths, divinely inspired. To question Galen was to question the very structure of reality. The practice became systematized, ritualized, ubiquitous, performed by physicians, the learned elite, but also by barber surgeons, tradesmen who combined hair cutting, tooth extraction, and minor surgical procedures. The iconic barber pole, with its red and white stripes, is a remnant of this era. The red representing blood, the white bandages, the pole itself, the staff patients grip to make their veins stand out. There were two primary methods, venesection and leeches. Venesection, or phlebotomy, involved opening a vein with a sharp blade called a lancet. The physician would tie a tourniquet around the limb to engorge the vein, make a swift incision, allow the blood to flow into a bowl. The amount taken varied wildly. The condition, the patient's constitution, the physician's judgment. Not uncommon to drain a pint or more at a time. The use of leeches, hirudotherapy, was the second method. The leech, a small segmented worm that feeds on blood, was seen as more gentle, more controlled. The creatures were applied to the skin. They'd attach with their suckers and begin to feed, injecting an anticoagulant to keep the blood flowing freely. A single leech could consume several times its body weight in blood before dropping off, sated. For delicate procedures, draining blood from near the eyes or temples, leeches were preferred over the lancet. Leeches became a commodity, traded across Europe. The medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis, was harvested from ponds and marshes, kept in jars in apothecaries and physicians' offices, applied to patients by the dozens, sometimes hundreds. There were leech farms, leech shortages. By the 19th century, demand was so great that wild populations were nearly hunted to extinction. Bloodletting was prescribed for everything. Fevers, obviously, but also headaches, dizziness, epilepsy, gout, indigestion, insomnia, depression, anxiety. Women were bled for menstrual irregularities. Pregnant women were bled to ensure safe delivery. Children were bled for teething pain. The elderly were bled to ward off infirmities of age. It was preventative medicine, performed on healthy individuals during certain times of year, spring especially, to purge the body of accumulated winter humours. Maintain equilibrium. There was even a calendar, a medical almanac, prescribed optimal days for bloodletting based on moon phases and star positions. Medicine and astrology weren't separate fields. They were intertwined, part of the same holistic understanding of cosmos and body. And people believed. They believed because the theory made sense. They believed because the physicians, trained at great universities, spoke with confidence and authority. They believed because Galen had said so, and Galen was never wrong. And perhaps most importantly, they believed because sometimes patients got better after being bled. This is the trap, the great cognitive snare. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We perform an action, observe a result, assume causation. A patient with fever is bled. The next day, fever breaks. Physician credits the bloodletting. Patient is grateful. The practice is reinforced. What neither understood was regression to the mean, or the simple fact that many illnesses are self-limiting. The human body, given time, will often heal itself. Fevers break. Headaches fade. Infections, if they don't kill, eventually resolve. The bloodletting didn't cure the patient. Time did. But without a framework for understanding this, without controlled experiments or statistical analysis, the illusion of efficacy was complete. And so the practice endured, century after century, pandemic after pandemic. The The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried on ships from the east, a plague of unimaginable horror. It killed, by conservative estimates, 1/3 of the continent's population. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities became charnel houses. The dead piled in streets, buried in mass graves, burned in pyres that darkened the sky. The physicians of the time, trained in Galenic medicine, had an explanation. The plague was caused by corruption of the air, a miasma that unbalanced the humours and flooded the body with pestilential plethora. The cure, naturally, was bloodletting. Bleed the patient to remove corrupted blood. Bleed them early. Bleed them often. It didn't work. Patients who were bled died, often more quickly than those who weren't. But the physicians didn't conclude bloodletting was ineffective. They concluded they hadn't bled the patients enough, or that they'd bled them too late, or that the plague was simply too powerful to be cured by earthly means. The theory was never questioned. The theory could not be questioned. It was the foundation upon which all medical knowledge rested. And so they bled. People died. The practice continued. The Renaissance brought a flowering of art, literature, science. It brought anatomists like Andreas Vesalius, who dared to dissect human cadavers and discovered Galen had been wrong about many things. The jaw was a single bone, not two. Blood didn't ebb and flow like tides, as Galen claimed. There were discrepancies, errors, gaps in the ancient texts. But even Vesalius, revolutionary in anatomy, didn't challenge the humoral theory or bloodletting. He corrected Galen's anatomy, but left his physiology intact. The two were seen as separate issues. One could acknowledge Galen had misunderstood the shape of the kidney without doubting his assertions about disease. It would take another giant to begin unravelling the mystery of blood, though even he couldn't topple the edifice of bloodletting. In 1628, an English physician named William Harvey published a slim volume, an anatomical exercise on the motion of the heart and blood in animals. In it, Harvey proposed something radical. Blood didn't ebb and flow like tides. It circulated. It moved in a closed loop, pumped by the heart through arteries to the body, returned through veins. He demonstrated this through careful experiments, measuring the volume of blood pumped by the heart. It was far too much to be continually produced and consumed. It had to be recycled, reused, circulating endlessly. It was a stunning insight, one of the foundational discoveries of modern medicine. It overturned 1,500 years of Galenic physiology. And yet, remarkably, it didn't end bloodletting. Physicians simply adapted the practice to the new framework. If blood circulated, they reasoned, removing some would still relieve pressure, reduce plethora, restore balance. The theory of the humours remained intact. The practice continued, now with added legitimacy of being compatible with cutting-edge science. The 17th and 18th centuries, the Age of Enlightenment, an era that prided itself on reason, logic, empirical observation. Bloodletting reached its absolute zenith, performed more frequently, more aggressively, with more confidence than ever before. The leading physicians of the age, the men who taught at great medical schools, were zealous advocates. One of the most influential was Benjamin Rush, a founding father of the United States, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the most famous physician in America. Rush was a man of towering intellect and equally towering certainty. He believed passionately in what he called heroic medicine, a system that favoured aggressive intervention over gentle observation. At the centre of his practice was bloodletting. Rush believed nearly all diseases were caused by vascular tension, an excessive accumulation of blood in the circulatory system. His cure was to bleed patients until they reached heroic depletion, removing enormous quantities of blood. far more than earlier physicians would have dared. He combined bloodletting with massive doses of calomel, a mercury compound that induced violent purging from both ends. His patients were drained, purged, blistered, a medical assault that left them utterly debilitated. And yet, Rush was revered. He trained generations of American physicians. His textbooks were standard, his methods widely adopted. When yellow fever struck Philadelphia in 1793, killing thousands, Rush stayed in the city and treated the sick with his aggressive bloodletting regimen. Many of his patients died. He attributed this to the severity of the fever, not his treatment. He saw himself as a hero, a warrior battling disease with every weapon at his disposal. The tragic irony is that Rush, a man of science and reason, a man who helped found a nation built on Enlightenment principles, couldn't see what should have been obvious. His cure was worse than the disease. And then came that cold December night in 1799. George Washington caught a chill. He'd been out riding in snow and sleet, inspecting his plantation. He came home wet and cold but refused to change his clothes before dinner. Didn't want to keep his guests waiting. By next morning, he woke with a sore throat and difficulty breathing. By evening, his condition had worsened. He could barely swallow, barely speak. Washington's personal physician wasn't available. 3 other doctors were summoned. They examined the former president and quickly reached consensus. He was suffering from quinsy, a severe throat infection, what we'd now call acute epiglottitis, or perhaps a peritonsillar abscess. The treatment was clear: bloodletting. They began in the early hours of December 14th. The first bleeding removed about 12 ounces of blood. When Washington's condition didn't improve, they bled him again, and again, and again. Over the course of that day, they drained approximately 80 ounces, roughly half his total blood volume. Washington grew weaker, his breathing more laboured, his pulse thready. The physicians, alarmed, disagreed among themselves. One, the youngest, suggested they stop the bleeding. The others overruled him. Surely, they reasoned, the plethora had not yet been sufficiently reduced. They administered more calomel, induced violent diarrhea, applied blisters to his throat to draw out inflammation. Washington, ever stoic, endured. He knew he was dying. In his final hours, he asked them to stop. "Doctor, I die hard," he whispered, "but I am not afraid to go." By late evening, he was gone. Modern medical analysis of Washington's symptoms and treatment has led most historians and physicians to conclude he likely died not from his illness, but from the treatment. The massive blood loss would have sent him into hypovolemic shock, drastically reducing oxygen supply to his organs. The blistering and purging would have further weakened him. Had he been left alone, given fluids and rest, he might well have survived. But the physicians of the time didn't see it that way. In their minds, they'd done everything right. They'd followed the teachings of Galen, the methods of the most respected medical authorities. If Washington died, it was because the disease was too strong, not because their treatment was wrong. The theory was never questioned. But cracks were forming in the edifice. A few voices, scattered and hesitant at first, began to ask uncomfortable questions. In the early 19th century, a French physician named Pierre-Charles-Alexandre Louis undertook something unprecedented. He applied mathematics to medicine. He began to count. Louis was a careful, methodical man. He was disturbed by the confidence with which his colleagues prescribed bloodletting without rigorous evidence of efficacy. So he decided to test it. He examined medical records of hundreds of patients suffering from pneumonia and other inflammatory diseases. He divided them into 2 groups: those who'd been bled aggressively and early, those who'd been bled more conservatively or later. Then he compared outcomes. What he found was shocking. Patients bled aggressively didn't recover faster. In fact, they did worse. Higher mortality rates, took longer to recuperate. The more blood taken, the worse the outcome. Louis published his findings in 1828. Researches on the effects of bloodletting in some inflammatory diseases. A dry statistical treatise, full of tables and figures. It was also revolutionary. For the first time in history, a physician had used empirical data to demonstrate that bloodletting, the cornerstone of medical practice for 2 millennia, was not only ineffective but harmful. The medical establishment reacted with predictable fury. Louis was attacked, dismissed, accused of misunderstanding the subtleties of clinical practice. Statistics, his critics argued, couldn't capture the art of medicine. Every patient was different, every case unique. The physician's skill lay in his ability to discern these differences, to adjust treatment accordingly. Numbers couldn't replace judgment. But Louis had opened a door. Others began to walk through it. The theory of the humours, which had seemed so elegant, so complete, was beginning to crumble. New discoveries in physiology, chemistry, pathology were revealing true causes of disease. Bacteria were discovered, viruses postulated. The germ theory of disease, proposed by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, provided a new framework. Disease wasn't caused by imbalance of humours, but by microscopic invaders. Bloodletting, seen through this new lens, made no sense. Draining a patient's blood didn't kill bacteria, didn't stop a virus. It only weakened the body's ability to fight. By the mid-19th century, the practice was in decline. Progressive medical schools stopped teaching it. Younger physicians trained in new science abandoned it, but it died slowly, clinging to life in the practices of older doctors, in rural areas, in corners of the world where tradition held sway over innovation. The last recorded instance of therapeutic bloodletting as mainstream medical practice occurred in the early 20th century. Today, in a few very specific conditions, controlled phlebotomy is used to reduce iron or red blood cell counts. And leeches have made a small comeback in microsurgery, their anticoagulant saliva useful in preventing blood clots in reattached digits and skin grafts. But these are narrow, evidence-based applications, a far cry from the universal panacea bloodletting once claimed to be. And so we arrive at the end of this long, dark chapter. We're left with a question. How did this happen? How did intelligent, educated, well-meaning physicians practice a therapy that killed for 2,000 years? The answer is both simple and profoundly unsettling. They believed in a story. The humoral theory wasn't random superstition. It was sophisticated, internally consistent model of human physiology. It explained disease, predicted outcomes, provided clear course of action. It was, in short, a theory. And theories are powerful. They shape how we see the world. They tell us what to look for and what to ignore. They give meaning to chaos. For 2 millennia, physicians looked at their patients through the lens of this theory. When a patient recovered after bloodletting, it confirmed the theory. When a patient died, it was because treatment had been applied too late, or disease was too severe, or patient's constitution too weak. The theory itself was never at fault. This is the human condition. We are storytellers. We crave narrative, causation, meaning. Once we have a story that explains the world, we cling to it. Even in the face of contradictory evidence, we're not stupid, not evil, simply human. The physicians who bled George Washington weren't murderers. They were healers, doing what they believed was right, following the best knowledge of their time. They were trapped by their education, by their reverence for authority, by the weight of 2,000 years of tradition. And this is the lesson, the quiet, unsettling truth that echoes down to us from the past. Knowledge is not linear. Progress is not inevitable. We can be wrong collectively and for centuries and never know it. The practices we hold as sacred today, the treatments we administer with confidence, may one day be seen as barbaric, as obvious errors that future generations will struggle to comprehend. The story of bloodletting is a story about the danger of certainty, the seduction of a beautiful theory, the immense tragic cost of refusing to question our assumptions. Consider the scale of the tragedy. 2,000 years. Across every continent where Western medicine spread, in every city, every town, every village, millions upon millions of people, already weakened by illness, further depleted by a treatment that offered no benefit and often hastened their death. How many lives were cut short? How many children bleeding from fever never saw adulthood? How many mothers bled during childbirth never held their babies? How many soldiers wounded on the battlefield survived the sword only to die from the lancet? We'll never know the true number. There are no comprehensive records, no global accounting of the dead, but conservative estimates place the death toll in the tens of millions. Some historians suggest it could be higher, much higher, if we count not just those who died directly from blood loss, but those whose already fragile health was tipped into fatal decline by the procedure. Imagine a parallel history, a world in which the humoral theory had been questioned earlier, a world in which physicians, faced with Louis' statistics in 1828, had immediately abandoned bloodletting. How many lives would have been saved in the decades that followed? How many minds that could have contributed to the arts, the sciences, the betterment of humanity, were lost to a practice that served no purpose? And yet we cannot be too harsh in our judgment. The physicians of the past weren't uniquely foolish. They were constrained by the limits of their time, by the absence of tools we take for granted. They had no microscopes to see bacteria, no understanding of the immune system, of oxygen transport, of cellular respiration, no concept of controlled clinical trials. They had a theory, incomplete but compelling, and they followed it with the best intentions. The tragedy is not that they were wrong. The tragedy is that they could not imagine they might be wrong. There's a final, quieter dimension to this story. Bloodletting wasn't just a medical practice, it was a ritual, a human connection between healer and patient. In a world before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before almost any effective treatment existed, what did a physician have to offer? Mostly he offered his presence, his attention, his attempt to do something, anything, to ease suffering. The act of bloodletting, however misguided, was an act of care. The physician leaned in close, examined the patient, spoke words of reassurance, performed a procedure believed to help, and the patient in turn felt heard, felt seen. In a world of uncertainty and fear, the physician's confidence, his action, provided psychological comfort. The placebo effect is real, even if the treatment itself is not. The belief that something is being done, that the healer is intervening, can reduce anxiety, improve mood, perhaps even aid recovery through mechanisms we still don't fully understand. This doesn't excuse the harm, but it helps us understand why the practice endured. It was embedded in the social fabric of medicine, in the expectations of patients, in the identity of physicians. To abandon bloodletting wasn't just to reject a medical technique. It was to admit that the entire profession had been operating under a false premise, that the trust patients placed in their doctors had been in some fundamental way betrayed. And so, even as evidence mounted, even as younger physicians began to see the truth, the old guard resisted, not out of malice, out of an inability to let go of their worldview, to accept that their life's work had been built on a foundation of sand. Let's pause here and consider the tools of the trade, the instruments that facilitated this practice for 2 millennia, because bloodletting wasn't just an idea, it was a physical act performed with specific implements that evolved over centuries, each one a testament to human ingenuity applied to a fundamentally flawed premise. The lancet was the primary tool, a small blade with a sharp pointed edge. Early lancets were simple, little more than sharpened pieces of metal, but as centuries progressed, they became objects of craftsmanship and pride. By the 18th century, a skilled barber surgeon or physician might own a collection, each one designed for a specific purpose. There were spring lancets that could be triggered with a thumb press, swift controlled incision. There were fleams, multi-bladed instruments with several different sized blades selected depending on the patient and the vein. The better lancets were made of finest steel, often imported from Sheffield in England, where blade making was an art form. The handles crafted from ivory, mother of pearl, precious metals. A wealthy physician might carry his lancets in a velvet-lined case, each instrument nestled in its own slot, polished and ready. These weren't just tools, they were symbols of status, markers of professional identity. Then there were the bleeding bowls, shallow vessels, often made of pewter, brass or ceramic, designed to catch the blood as it flowed from the opened vein. Many were marked with gradations, lines indicating ounces or pints. The physician could measure precisely how much blood had been taken. Some bowls were decorated with elaborate engravings or painted designs. In wealthier households, the family might own their own bleeding bowl, passed down through generations. A domestic medical instrument as common as a thermometer is today. The tourniquet, a band or cord tied tightly around the limb above the point of incision, essential for making the veins stand out. Simple technology but effective. The physician would tie it, wait for the vein to engorge with blood, then make his cut. After the procedure, the tourniquet would be loosened, pressure applied to stop the bleeding, and then, of course, the leeches. These creatures, slimy and segmented, kept in specialized jars called leech jars, often ceramic vessels with perforated lids to allow air circulation while preventing escape. Inside, the leeches would swim in water, waiting to be selected for use. A physician might keep dozens on hand, replenishing his supply from local ponds or purchasing them from apothecaries. The application of leeches was considered a delicate art. The creature would be placed on the skin, encouraged to latch on. Sometimes, if a leech was reluctant, the physician would prick the skin with a pin to draw a drop of blood, enticing the leech to feed. Once attached, the leech would feed for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, its body swelling grotesquely as it consumed blood. When sated, it would drop off on its own, leaving a small wound that would continue to ooze for hours due to the anticoagulant in the leech's saliva. There was even a device called a scarificator, a truly ingenious if macabre invention. A small box with multiple spring-loaded blades inside. When triggered, all the blades would shoot out simultaneously, making several small parallel cuts in the skin. This was used in wet cupping. The scarificator would create the cuts, then a heated glass cup would be placed over the wounds. As the air inside cooled and contracted, it created a vacuum, drawing blood out of the cuts and into the cup, considered less invasive than opening a vein, suitable for patients too weak for traditional venesection. All of these tools, all of this craftsmanship, all of this accumulated knowledge about techniques and procedures served a practice that was, at its core, harmful. It's a sobering reminder that technological sophistication doesn't equal medical efficacy. The finest lancet in the world, wielded by the most skilled hand, was still removing something the body desperately needed. The geography of bloodletting varied as well, both in technique and cultural acceptance. While the practice was universal across Europe and the Islamic world, different regions developed their own preferences and methods. In France, for example, there was a long tradition of aggressive bloodletting. French physicians in the 17th and 18th centuries were known for their enthusiasm. La saignée, they called it. Not uncommon for patients to be bled multiple times a week, sometimes daily, for chronic conditions. The French court physicians, treating the kings and nobility at Versailles, performed bloodletting as routine. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was reportedly bled over 40 times in a single year, as much a part of royal ritual as the ceremonial rising in the morning. In England, the practice was equally common, but perhaps slightly more restrained, at least until the 18th century, when it surged in popularity. English physicians wrote extensively about optimal seasons for bloodletting, the best veins to tap, the proper amount to remove. The Royal College of Physicians, the august body that regulated medical practice in England, fully endorsed the procedure, taught it as fundamental to medical training. In the Islamic world, the tradition had its own lineage, influenced by both Galenic medicine, which Arab scholars had preserved and translated, and by indigenous practices. The great Islamic physician Avicenna, Ibn Sina, wrote extensively about bloodletting in his massive medical encyclopedia, The Canon of Medicine. His work was studied throughout the medieval Islamic world and later translated into Latin, influencing European medicine for centuries. In some Islamic cultures, bloodletting was performed not just by physicians, but by barbers and even religious figures. There were specific traditions about which days were auspicious for the procedure, often tied to the lunar calendar. In China, the practice took a different form. Traditional Chinese medicine had its own system of understanding the body, based on the flow of qi, or life energy, through meridians. Bloodletting in China was often more targeted and ritualized, used to relieve specific blockages rather than drain general plethora, sometimes combined with acupuncture, the needles used to puncture specific points to release small amounts of blood. The theoretical framework was different from Western humoral theory, but the underlying belief was similar, that releasing blood from the body could restore balance and health. In the Americas, indigenous practices before European contact included forms of scarification and bloodletting for ritual and medicinal purposes, though these were typically less aggressive than European methods. After colonization, European bloodletting was imposed as part of broader cultural and medical colonization. Native populations, already devastated by European diseases to which they had no immunity, were subjected to bloodletting by missionary doctors and colonial physicians, often with catastrophic results. The global reach of bloodletting is testament to the power of a compelling theory. It transcended cultures, languages, religions, practiced in palaces and peasant cottages, in bustling cities and remote villages. It was, for better or worse, one of the few truly universal aspects of pre-modern medicine. There were, of course, skeptics throughout history, voices that questioned the practice, suggested perhaps it wasn't as beneficial as claimed. But these voices were few, drowned out by the chorus of authority. In the 1st century CE, a Greek physician named Thessalus of Tralles founded a sect called the Methodists. They rejected the humoral theory, argued for gentler treatments. They were dismissed as cranks by the Galenic establishment. In the 16th century, the Swiss physician Paracelsus, a bombastic and controversial figure, rejected much of Galenic medicine, including excessive bloodletting. He argued the body should be treated with chemical remedies, not drained of vital fluids. He was mocked, persecuted, largely ignored by the medical mainstream. Even within the establishment, there were occasional notes of caution. Some physicians in the 17th and 18th centuries wrote treatises urging moderation. warning that too much bloodletting could weaken the patient. But these were quibbles about degree, not challenges to the fundamental principle. The question was never whether bloodletting worked, but how much to take and when. It's worth reflecting on why these dissenting voices were so easily dismissed. Part of the answer lies in the structure of medical education. To become a physician, one had to study at a university. Universities were institutions of tradition. The curriculum was based on ancient texts, primarily the works of Galen and Hippocrates. To question these texts was to question the foundation of one's own education, one's own authority as a healer, to undermine the very system that granted physicians their status and livelihood. Moreover, there was no mechanism for systematic testing of treatments. The modern clinical trial, with its control groups, randomization, statistical analysis, didn't exist. Without these tools, it was nearly impossible to definitively prove a treatment was ineffective. Every physician had anecdotal evidence of patients who improved after bloodletting. The fact that these patients might have improved anyway, or that many others died, was lost in the noise of individual experience. And so the practice persisted, insulated from criticism by the very structures meant to safeguard medical knowledge. The economic dimension of bloodletting is also worth examining. The practice wasn't just a medical procedure. It was a business, a livelihood for thousands of practitioners. Barber surgeons, who performed the majority of bloodletting for common people, depended on the practice for income. In many towns and cities, the barber surgeon was a fixture of daily life. His shop a gathering place where men came not just for a shave but for medical advice, tooth extractions, and of course, bloodletting. The barber pole outside his shop was an advertisement for his services. For university-trained physicians serving wealthier clients, bloodletting was a crucial part of their practice. A physician who stopped recommending it might lose patients to competitors who still did. The economic incentive to continue was strong. If a patient believed they needed to be bled and the physician refused, the patient might simply find another physician who would oblige. The leech trade was its own industry. By the early 19th century, at the height of bloodletting's popularity, France alone was importing millions of leeches annually, primarily from Eastern Europe and Russia. Leech gatherers waded into swamps and marshes, allowing the creatures to attach to their legs, then pulling them off and collecting them in baskets. Dangerous, unpleasant work, but it paid. The leeches were sold to wholesalers who shipped them across Europe to apothecaries and physicians. The trade was so extensive it led to near extinction of the medicinal leech in many parts of Europe. By the mid-19th century, wild populations had collapsed. Leech farms were established to meet demand. When bloodletting finally fell out of favour, these entire industries collapsed almost overnight, leaving thousands without their traditional livelihoods. This economic reality created another layer of resistance to change. To abandon bloodletting wasn't just to abandon a medical theory. It was to disrupt an entire ecosystem of trade, training, tradition. To render obsolete the skills barber surgeons had spent years perfecting. To devalue the expensive collections of lancets physicians had accumulated. There were powerful, if usually unspoken, incentives to maintain the status quo. Let's turn now to some specific cases beyond Washington to illustrate the human cost of this practice. In 1685, King Charles II of England suffered a seizure, likely a stroke. His royal physicians, the most learned men in the kingdom, immediately sprang into action. Over the next 5 days, they subjected the king to a battery of treatments that reads like a catalogue of medical horrors. They bled him repeatedly, taking a total of 24 ounces of blood. They applied heated glasses to his shoulders to draw out more blood through cupping. They administered emetics to make him vomit, purgatives to induce diarrhea. They shaved his head and applied blistering agents to raise welts on his scalp. They forced him to drink a concoction made from 40 drops of human skull extract. Charles II died on February 6, 1685. The physicians concluded they'd done everything humanly possible, but the king's affliction had been too severe. Modern analysis suggests Charles might have survived the initial stroke had he been left alone to rest. Instead, he was tortured to death by the best medical care available. In 1824, Lord Byron, the celebrated Romantic poet, fell ill with fever while fighting for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. His physicians in Missolonghi, Greece, insisted on bloodletting despite Byron's own reluctance. Over the course of several days, weakened by fever and blood loss, Byron's condition deteriorated. He died on April 19th, at the age of 36. His death was mourned across Europe. He became a martyr for the Greek cause. But he need not have died. The aggressive bloodletting almost certainly hastened his end. These are famous cases, documented in letters and medical records. But for every king or poet whose death we can trace, there were thousands, millions of ordinary people whose suffering went unrecorded. The mother who died in childbirth bled to prevent what her midwife feared might be excessive blood flow during delivery. The child with measles, already weak from fever, further depleted by the physician's lancet. The soldier recovering from wounds, who might have lived had he not been subjected to prophylactic bloodletting to prevent infection. Each of them a life cut short by a practice that promised healing. And then there were the patients who survived, but suffered needlessly. Bloodletting wasn't always fatal. The human body is remarkably resilient, capable of recovering from significant blood loss if given time and proper nutrition. But the process of recovery was made infinitely harder by the repeated draining of blood. Imagine a young woman in the 18th century suffering from what we'd now recognize as anemia, perhaps caused by poor diet or heavy menstrual bleeding. She feels weak, tired, dizzy. She consults a physician. He diagnoses her with an excess of black bile, a melancholic humour, prescribes bloodletting to restore balance. She's bled once, then again a week later, then again. Each time she loses more of the iron-rich blood her body desperately needs. Her anemia worsens. She grows paler, weaker. The physician, seeing his treatment isn't working, concludes the imbalance is more severe than he thought. He increases the frequency of bloodletting. The spiral continues until either the patient dies or she becomes too weak to continue treatment and is left alone, at which point, ironically, her body finally begins to recover. This scenario played out countless times, across centuries, across continents. The treatment created the very symptoms it claimed to cure. Today, we live in a different world. We have randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, peer review, evidence-based guidelines. A system, imperfect but far superior to what came before, designed to catch errors, to test assumptions, to ensure treatments actually work before they're widely adopted. And yet, the ghost of bloodletting lingers. There are still treatments used today that have little or no evidence to support them. Still practices driven more by tradition, by anecdote, by the forceful personality of a respected physician than by rigorous science. Medical fads come and go. Pharmaceutical companies push drugs with aggressive marketing, sometimes before long-term risks are fully understood. Surgeries are performed that may offer no benefit over conservative management. We're not immune to the errors of the past. We're simply further along the curve of understanding. And that curve is asymptotic. We'll never reach perfect knowledge. There will always be uncertainty, always be room for error. The best we can do is remain humble, remain questioning, remain willing to admit when we're wrong. The physicians of the 21st century will one day be judged by the physicians of the 23rd. Some of what we do will seem as misguided as bloodletting seems to us now. This isn't cause for despair. It's cause for vigilance, for intellectual humility, for commitment to the scientific method, even when it contradicts our intuitions, our training, our deeply held beliefs. There's a monument in Paris, in the courtyard of the Hôpital de la Charité, that few tourists ever see. A small bronze plaque, weathered by time, dedicated to Pierre-Charles-Alexandre Louis, the man who dared to count, who applied cold mathematics to the warm art of healing, and in doing so began to end a practice that had killed millions. The inscription is simple. It doesn't recount his many achievements, doesn't list the titles he held or papers he published. It simply says, in French, he measured. It's a fitting tribute, because in the end, that's what saved us. Not a grand revelation, not a sudden epiphany, but the slow, painstaking work of observation, measurement, honest accounting. The willingness to look at the data, even when it contradicted 2,000 years of accumulated wisdom. The history of bloodletting isn't just a medical curiosity, it's a parable about human nature, about the stories we tell ourselves, about the institutions we build and the difficulty of tearing them down even when they no longer serve us. It's about the inertia of tradition, the seductive power of theory, the courage required to say, simply and clearly, we were wrong. In the cold hours before dawn on December 14th, 1799, George Washington died. The 3 physicians who attended him left Mount Vernon in the pale morning light, exhausted, defeated, convinced they'd done everything within the power of medical science to save him. They carried with them their porcelain bowls, their lancets, their leeches. They carried the accumulated weight of 2,000 years of medical tradition. They carried, though they didn't know it, the blood of the first President of the United States on their hands. And the world moved on. The practice of bloodletting continued for another 50 years, then began its long, slow decline. The theory of the humours was abandoned. New discoveries replaced old certainties. Medicine advanced, stumbling and uncertain, toward a better understanding of the human body. But for a moment, in that candlelit bedroom at Mount Vernon, we can see it all laid bare. The tragedy of good intentions, the danger of certainty, the quiet, terrible cost of a cure that killed. Let's sit for a moment in the uncomfortable space of reflection. Think about the physicians of the past, not with contempt, but with a measure of compassion and humility. They weren't monsters. They were us, or what we would have been had we lived in their time, with their knowledge, their pressures, their limitations. And think about the patients, the millions who suffered, who died, who placed their trust in a system that failed them. They're voiceless now, lost to history, their names unrecorded, but they were real. Each one a person with hopes, with families, with lives unlived. Their legacy is this, the lesson that we must always question, always test, always be willing to admit error, that the greatest danger in medicine, and perhaps in all human endeavours, is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. The certainty that we're right when we are, in fact, profoundly wrong. Bloodletting lasted for 2,000 years because it was never truly questioned. It ended when someone finally dared to count the bodies, to measure the outcomes, to follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it led to an uncomfortable truth. May we have the courage to do the same. The lancet has been put away. The leeches have returned to their ponds. The theory of the humours has been consigned to the history books. But the questions remain. How do we know what we know? How do we separate signal from noise, truth from tradition, effective treatment from comforting ritual? These aren't easy questions. They require humility, skepticism, willingness to be wrong, They require us to hold our beliefs lightly, to subject them to scrutiny, to change our minds when evidence demands it. The story of bloodletting is a reminder that knowledge is provisional, that progress is fragile, that the human capacity for self-deception is immense. But it's also a reminder that we can learn, that we can improve, that we can slowly and with great effort move toward a better understanding of ourselves and the world. The physicians of the future will look back on us. They'll shake their heads at some of what we do. They'll wonder how we could have been so blind, and they'll be right to wonder. But perhaps they'll also recognize that we, like those who came before us, did the best we could with the knowledge we had, that we tried to heal even when our tools were inadequate, that we sought truth even when we stumbled. And perhaps in that recognition, they'll treat us with the same compassion we might now, finally, extend to those who once believed the cure for illness lay in the opening of a vein. So tonight, as you turn off the light and close your eyes, think for a moment about blood. Think about the mystery it represented to the ancients, the certainty it inspired in physicians, the lives it claimed in the name of healing. Think about George Washington breathing his last, his body drained, his physicians standing by in helpless confusion. And think about Pierre Louis, sitting at his desk, counting, adding, comparing, slowly, reluctantly, coming to a conclusion that would shake the foundations of medicine. The courage it took to publish those findings, the resistance he faced, the lives that were eventually saved because one man dared to measure. The history of bloodletting is over, but the lesson is not. It's here, now, in every decision we make, every belief we hold, every tradition we follow without question. The cure that killed millions is gone, but the human capacity for error, for certainty in the face of contrary evidence, for following beautiful theories off the edge of a cliff, remains. It's part of who we are. Our task then isn't to condemn the past, but to learn from it, to question, to measure, to remain humble, to remember that the most dangerous words in any field aren't "I don't know," but "I am certain." And in that remembering, perhaps, we can avoid building the next bloodletting, the next beautiful, seductive, deadly practice that will one day, centuries from now, be looked back upon with horror and incomprehension. We're not done making mistakes, but we can at least try to make new ones. The candles at Mount Vernon have long since guttered out. The bowls of blood have been emptied and washed. The lancets have been cleaned and put away. George Washington is buried on the grounds of his beloved estate. His death a quiet tragedy that closed one chapter and, in a small way, helped open another. Medicine has moved on. We have antibiotics, vaccines, surgery that can repair the heart and transplant organs. We can peer inside the living body with scanners and scopes. We can read the very code of life in the human genome. We've accomplished miracles the physicians of 1799 couldn't have imagined. And yet, in all this progress, in all this stunning advancement, the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do we help? How do we heal? How do we do no harm? The Hippocratic Oath, that ancient pledge taken by physicians for over 2 millennia, contains a simple phrase: first, do no harm, a principle easier stated than followed. Because harm can come not just from action, but from inaction, not just from what we do, but from what we fail to question. For 2,000 years, physicians believed they were helping. They opened veins, they applied leeches, they drained the blood from the sick, and they believed, with absolute conviction, they were fulfilling their oath. They were doing no harm. They were restoring balance. They were following the wisdom of the ancients. They were wrong. And so the final lesson of bloodletting is this: the road to hell is paved not with evil intentions, but with unexamined assumptions. with deference to authority, with the comfort of tradition, with the seductive elegance of a beautiful theory. The cure lies not in certainty, but in doubt, not in knowing, but in questioning, not in following the wisdom of the past, but in being willing to overturn it when evidence demands. There's a quiet nobility in admitting error, in saying, we were wrong, we must do better, a nobility that took medicine 2,000 years to achieve in the case of bloodletting. But achieve it we did. And in that achievement, in that slow, painful recognition of error and embrace of evidence, we can find a measure of hope. We can change. We can learn. We can eventually overcome even the most deeply entrenched mistakes. But it takes time. It takes courage. It takes individuals willing to stand against the tide of accepted wisdom and say, quietly but firmly, I have counted. I have measured. And the numbers tell a different story. Pierre Louis did that. Ignaz Semmelweis did that. John Snow did that. They weren't always believed, weren't always celebrated, but they were right, and slowly, agonizingly, the world came around. So here, at the end of our journey through the history of bloodletting, we honour them. The questioners, the counters, the skeptics who refuse to accept tradition as truth. And we honour too the millions of unnamed patients who suffered and died under a treatment that promised healing but delivered only harm. They're the true cost of certainty, the forgotten victims of a beautiful theory. May we remember them, may we learn from them, may we never forget that the greatest danger in medicine, in science, in governance, in any human endeavour is not the unknown, but the illusion that we've conquered it. The night is deep now. The story is told. The blood has long since dried and been washed away. But the lessons remain. Written not in medical journals or stone monuments, but in the fragile, imperfect institution of human memory. Bloodletting. The 2,000-year cure that killed millions. A practice born of reason, sustained by tradition, ended by the simple act of counting. A reminder that we're capable of great error, and if we're vigilant, of great correction. As you drift towards sleep, carry this with you. The knowledge that progress isn't guaranteed, that truth is hard won, that the fight against dogma and complacency is never truly finished. But carry too a measure of hope. Because we did eventually stop bleeding our patients, we did eventually learn. And if we could overcome 2,000 years of bloodletting, perhaps we can overcome whatever errors we're committing now, the ones we cannot yet see. The physicians of the future are counting on us, and we in turn must never stop counting. Good night.